Uh, Hello, everyone, and we will be continuing our event today. At first panel, we had a discussion about European Union, Ukraine, and more focused on what's going on in European Union-Ukraine relations and perspectives. And discussing practical steps, but this panel is about, I would say, more global issues, and we named it Reaching Out for Common Security Beyond Europe and North America. And my colleague, Maksym Yakovlyev, who is a director of School for Policy Analysis and head of Department of International Relations at our university, which is National University of Kiev Mohila Academy, will be moderating this panel. So I will be passing the floor to him. And if I might remind that this event is online event and discussion is within the joint Horizon project on making European foreign policy more joint and strengthened with the purpose of strengthening for the global security too. So it's a big ambition, and I wish you a fruitful discussion. There will be should be one more participant joining. He already joined in the previous panel, so I hope he will join shortly. But Maksym, I'm passing the floor to you.
Thank you, Anna. Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to moderate this discussion. And I'm glad that apart from being the Director of School for Policy Analysis, I'm also head of International Relations Department, and talking with such a distinguished audience, meaning you all together, on a very interesting topic is also my great pleasure. So I think that we can start following way. I will briefly introduce our participants. I hope I pronounce your names all correctly. And then since we can do this spoiler to our audience that everybody received the questions. So I will play a bit maybe with the questions, but they were sent to our distinguished participants. And we then can start a discussion, I guess, in rounds, like one question at a round. Everybody speaks what he thinks on the topic, and then we'll continue, maybe also providing reactions to what every participant of this panel said. Okay, if that is fine with everyone, I need to use my checklist of information to present everybody correctly. Okay, so I would like to start in the order that was given to the presenters. And first, I would like to introduce Jesutimi Akamo, or simply Timi, who is coordinator of Research and Policy Analysis Unit, Africa Peace and Security Program, Institute for Peace and Security Studies. So thank you very much, Amasegenalo, for joining us today. Then we also have Rusbeh Parsi, I hope I also pronounced the name correctly, head of Middle East and North Africa Program, Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Tackar mycket att du har funnit tid att vara här med oss och diskutera om våra frågor. Thank you for that. Then we are waiting, as Anna said, for one more participant to join on the list. It's also my great pleasure to welcome here Mr. Radityo Dharmaputra. Terima kasih that you found time and joined. It is very good that we have a platform of the discussion of the people from different places and positions. Radityo is lecturer at the Department of International Relations, Universitas Airlangga in Surabaya, Indonesia. He's head of the Airlangga Center for European and Eurasian Studies. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining. I think once our one participant that we're waiting for joins us, we'll present him, but I think not to waste time, because time is a very precious resource, and also realizing that we are all in different time zones now. I think it's good that we start our discussion. I think in the order that I presented, we can take the questions for our panel, which are very interesting. And I have to say that before composing this panel, we also had discussion both with our team and some of the organizers on how to frame it to avoid the term global south or something like that, which was also very difficult. And just recently I saw a short publication in The Economist on how to redefine what is actually global south, where it is. So we have just common questions and themes to discuss. And maybe I will start with the first one, which is very brief. And we framed our panel as reaching out for common security beyond Europe and North America, which is very important also for other parts of the globe. So the first question that I would like to ask my distinguished guests and speakers today is, what are the main concerns of Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, and also Southeast Asia, because we have Raditya from Indonesia, about the current world security architecture? So I suggest that we take one by one your answers, or like position statement. What are the main security threats or concerns, so to speak? And if I may, I would like to give the floor first to Mr. Timi. Timi, please, you can start.
Hi, good afternoon from Addis Ababa. Greetings from my directors here at the program and at the Institute. I'm really glad that you pronounced my name quite very much more impressive than every other person that I've heard pronounce my name in the context of Europe. My name is Joseph Timlen Yakamo. You can call me Timmy once again. I coordinate the Research and Policy Analysis Unit under the Africa Peace and Security Program at the Institute for Peace and Security Studies. And I was part of the joint project. I was the one that took the lead from my institute side on the joint project. First, I would like to very clearly state that what is going on in Ukraine is very terrible. And it's further highlights the need to rethink how we consider what security is. I mean, broadly speaking, it provokes the need to rethink what security is for the world within the context of interdependence, within the context of mutual support, within the context of a rules-based order that is inclusive of all the key stakeholders on the globe. The main concerns for Sub-Saharan Africa, I would highlight two, and maybe along the line, depending on the questions that come up, I would expound and maybe go into other points. The first one is the issue around addressing perceived hypocrisy, which have negatively affected the continent. And my first, or let me say, one of the prevailing issues that exposed this particular point is the issue around democracy and the issue around ongoing conflicts on the continent, especially in relation to Africans, not necessarily African governments, to be specific. And it revolves around the question, who gets the global attention and why? So I would cite the Democratic Republic of Congo as an example, Sudan, the conflict in Ethiopia, the ongoing what fits into the context of what a genocide is in southern Kaduna in Nigeria, which in many publications have seen to be ignorantly or mischievously pinned on climate change, which is actually inaccurate, and Libya's case, for example. So in terms of the global security architecture, these are issues that the way, permit me to say, the West or Europe or even the US have responded, they've responded in a way that that's why I called it perceived hypocrisy, in a way that is not consistent with some of the things that it ought to be consistent with. So you support one, you don't support the other. You get interested in this, you don't get interested in the other. You provide diplomatic, technical, and political support for this one, you don't provide for the other. And accumulatively over the years, it has led to a decline in the security landscape, especially in the Sahel. And not only that, it has also led to what I presented at the conference in Barcelona last year, I think September, October, what I considered where the need to desecuritize. The securitized approach to issues often pin certain challenges on problems, and there is less attention on opportunities. So often when investments, which leads me to my second point on investments in the current security architecture, is that the securitized approach has put a lot of focus on the problems and less focus on the opportunities in Africa. There has been attempts to move away from that approach, but it has not been strong enough and it has not received its deserved attention. So to answer your question on the main concerns of Sub-Saharan Africa, is the issue of what are the key actors doing in the African context? How do they influence, or what do they bring to the table when responding to Africa's security issues? And in terms of investment, also beyond the securitized approach, I would like to note that indeed actors like the EU, for example, does invest heavily in Africa's peace and security. But one issue is that, quoting a senior colleague of mine, money is necessary but not sufficient. Often when financial investments go into some of these countries, they are used to support administrations, structures, systems that more often undermine Africa's security. So when you are discussing Africa's security within the global security architecture, what an average African often sees is how does it help me? How does it make sure I'm safer? And if I'm not able to answer that question, for example, whoever is supposedly the key actors or the interveners they are often portrayed in negative light, and that affects their engagement in the eventuality that there is a need for an intervention. And that is exactly the problem we are seeing with the coup countries in West Africa. The coup leaders are banking, or they are leveraging the local support that they have to keep their stance. So at some point, it's not more about the normative issues on democracy. It's not more about the normative issues of freedom. It's more about, oh, this outsider. So there's that gap. You say this outsider has come, and in the past engagement, they've supported governments that have not really helped us, that have been poor. They've supported poor administrations. They supported faulty democracies. And as a result of that, the perspective keeps getting, permit me to say, darker by the year, which needs to be addressed. So in terms of the key concerns, first, perceived hypocrisy, which have had a negative impact on the continent. And the second is, what are the advancements of the current security architecture in Africa? Thank you.
Thank you, Timmy. I have to say that before presenting, I watched the video with Joint Project on YouTube where you presented yourself with your name correctly, and I tried to speak it after that. It was that was one of the strategies to find out how to say your name. But thank you very much for your points, and thank you very much for summarizing at the end, where you said that the perceived hypocrisy, one of the main concerns, we also started with this point. Then I also have to stress your point, which I find very important, when speaking about security concerns in Africa and all sorts only of financial investments, because you said that money is necessary but not sufficient, and exactly where does the money go, how it increases the security. Or you also raised this question from the African perspective, how does it help me, meaning how does it increase my security if possible? It's also one of the important comments and points that you raised. But not to steal your time as a moderator, I would then like that we move. But before we move, we have Sinan Ulgen, who joined us. I saw that he was with us already. Sinan, are you here? Oh yeah, okay. I can now see you. Thank you for joining. Sinan Ulgen is Director of the Center for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies and Senior Fellow at Carnegie Europe. So teşekkür ederim for joining our discussion. So I said that we one by one answer the questions that were sent to you in advance, and now we continue as we go by the list. And I would like now to give the floor to Ruspe Parsi. Varsågod.
Thank you. Thank you for arranging and organizing this very interesting conversation and getting views from many different parts of the world. I will kind of segue from what the previous speaker said. I think one of the things that we already know, it's not a particular shock, is that the system that we live in is hypocritical, and that states tend to see what they want to see, and they are closer to some states and further away from other states, which of course affects their political priorities. That being said, that's not an excuse. It's just a statement of observation. We can see that the effect of this hypocrisy can be larger or smaller, depending on how dysfunctional the international system is. And perhaps what we are seeing right now is the ongoing arc of the trend that we no longer live in anything that remotely looks like a consensus of what the rules-based order is. And therefore, the hypocrisy of each great power, if you will, becomes much more evident as they are very selective in how they apply, whether it is their moral yardstick or whether it is their financial or political or military yardstick. Now, of course, this is a cause for great concern and despair, considering how the world looks. But I think it is important here then to make a distinction, which could potentially be helpful both analytically and politically, between what we often, at least in the West, refer to as the rules-based order and what the whole world at least acknowledges as international law. Those two are not the same. The rules-based order, as far as I can see, is more the Western practice, which is partly also based on the fact that the UN Security Council became less clogged after the fall of the Soviet Union and could allow itself to act more actively than it usually does. But that was based on the Soviet Union going away as an actor that could stop things, and Russia not yet taking its place in a way that it felt the need, so to speak, to often be the obstructionist, if you want to put it like that. That frail consensus, or whatever you want to call it, does not exist anymore. So that is one aspect of what we could generally call multipolarity. And the other one is, of course, not necessarily antagonistic, but nonetheless has an element of antagonism, and that is the rise of China, which in turn begets the, so far at least, cognitive dissonance of American inability or unwillingness to really take in what that potentially could mean. And we know this from history, of course, that dominant hegemons aren't exactly very accepting of the potential successor that might come along. And those confrontations tend to end up in violence. Now, of course, we can hope that in this case it won't, but it is something to take into account that sometimes what we're seeing right now in terms of conflicts and this disjointed way of understanding or reading a conflict does not necessarily have to do with ideology or even, for good or worse, with different moral yardsticks, as much as how it connects to the realpolitik of what it's supposed to mean for me. And I think especially in the Middle East, you see this in the sense that a lot of countries feel a greater ability to be autonomous. Now, whether this is true or not in any kind of spreadsheet, objective fact measurement is almost beside the point. The thing is that the political elites of these countries believe themselves to be more autonomous. And that does not mean that they are picking sides. That's the whole point. What it means is that they want to be able to talk and trade with everyone. So it's more the complementarity of a new multipolar system than that they are choosing Russia over the US or some such. Now, of course, this means that they have to instrumentalize hypocrisy, so to speak. That means they will condemn the very, very illegal and unlawful invasion of Ukraine, but it does not necessarily entail breaking relations with Russia. And so to what extent one wants to consider this to be a position on the issue of Ukraine, of course, depends on whether you think these things are mutually exclusive or not. If you consider them to be mutually exclusive, then of course you will interpret this as a stand against someone. But if you think of it in a sense, in a more, I'm not going to use the word rational, I don't find it very useful, but multipolar without necessarily taking in the moral dimension immediately, you can see that it might be motivated by other things. Now, the end result might still be considered immoral, that is fully possible, but the question is whether it was the active variable that made you take the decision. And that's where I think that we sometimes in Europe tend to overread and overinterpret these positions, making them more moral than they have to be, which does not mean that we have to say that there is no moral stance to be had on the issue of Ukraine, for instance. But it does mean that you have to take into account that the calculation for others might not have started or ended up there. All that is fine, and in a sense problematic and complicated as it is. But here comes the hypocrisy again, and this will be my last point. For all the criticism that Europe can and has shown to the rest of the world when it has not been as willing, if you will, or enthusiastic in taking up the cause of Ukraine when Europe comes and asks for it, Europe has been equally hypocritical when it comes to reacting to Gaza, which of course for the Middle East and for many other parts of the world is another clear case of something that both requires moral action, but also has very clear realpolitik and international relations implications. And so that means that the hypocrisy tends to come around again and again, and it is therefore very difficult to kind of demand positions by others when one in real time refuses to take positions on other cases, which then tend to be important for the people one is demanding an answer from. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I also made a couple of notes from your presentation, if I may stress some of them, because you continued Tim's strength of talking about hypocrisy, which I found also illuminating. And your first statement was that well, the system we live in is hypocritical. And then you elaborated a bit more on this idea, and also I noted down this notion or concept of how to instrumentalize hypocrisy to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but on the other hand, not to cut all the ties, including and mostly important trading ties with Russia. And I like that you also brought about the topic of moral actions and the calls for moral actions and hypocrisy there that we have. And you also raised the issue, which is I found also illuminating and interesting for further discussion potentially, is that the rule-based order which is more based on Western practices and how it is perceived and how it can also be changed in the future, because we see that the current world architecture of security is basically crumbling. And also the rise of China, you briefly mentioned that within the notion of multipolarity, and also the American inability to recognize and also maybe to be prepared for another rivalry, which are also very interesting. Thank you. So these are a couple of notes that I took as moderator. Thank you. I think we can continue with this question. And since Sinan joined us, and I promised to go on the list of the presenters that was sent around, I hope, Radityo, you don't mind that I give now the floor to Sinan as going by the list. So please, Sinan, the floor is yours now.
Yes. Hello, Maksym. Good to be with you all. Really enjoying being part of this conversation. I'm going to try to bring a Turkish perspective, given where I am, and looking at this security conundrum and the implications of the Ukraine war on the security order. There are three things which make a Turkish perspective, rather, I think, valuable in the grand scheme of things. One is that Turkey is not a EU country, but it's a NATO member. And therefore, it sits on the divide between NATO and the EU regarding the future of the European security architecture. Because Turkey's EU relationship has stalled, maybe I may need to turn my video off if it's frozen and you can't hear me correctly. Maybe just voice might be better.
No, we can see and hear you perfect. No problem.
Oh, okay, fine.
No problem. Connection is fine. Thank you.
I sometimes freeze. So the traditional tenet of Turkey's outlook towards regarding the security architecture has essentially been shaped by Turkey's NATO membership, especially since there has been a very lukewarm approach to the EU developing as a security actor, essentially because the EU has been doing this in a way that has totally excluded Turkey's interest and Turkey's involvement. Therefore, looking ahead, Turkey will want the European security architecture to continue to be shaped by the transatlantic alliance and NATO. And this is where, obviously, the results of the US elections will be very important. because depending on one outcome, namely if Trump wins, this is likely to very much revitalize momentum within Europe and particularly within the EU to develop capabilities in the area of security and defense that are independent from the United States. Especially if we see, a Trump administration essentially saying to the Europeans that Ukraine is your problem, and there won't be any more U.S. support to the war in Ukraine. The U.S. strategic interest lies elsewhere.
I think we lost sound. Sinan, we can see you, but there is no sound. Is it my problem?
Southeast Asia, including with India, and not just the AUKUS phenomenon and additional security consolidation of the security partnership with Japan and Korea, but really a very much U.S. security outlook shifting to these alliances that are mostly bilateral in nature, but some movement on the regional as well, as we, as I alluded to in terms of AUKUS. And I would certainly be interested to hear, the outlook from Indonesia on this, given that this is much closer to their, to their region. But nonetheless, this is the type of scenario that might unfold if we were to see a Republican foreign policy dictated by Trump. And this is, very averse. They would be very averse from Turkey's perspective regarding European security. Firstly, it would give room for Russia to test, the credibility of Article 5. And that's essentially testing the core of NATO. This could happen in the Baltics. That's probably the scenario that's more sort of that we can contemplate, because already there Russia has been essentially infringing both essentially the air territory of some of these states. So there's a NATO mission, NATO air policing mission that's been sent there. So that's one particular challenge. The second one is the question of whether Europe can actually deliver on its security needs in a scenario where the relationship with the United States has become very problematic. And this is where, a lot of advanced work needs to be done. And already we see signs of that. Mainly, there is discussion about how to make a new, first of all, pass a package of support to Ukraine before the US elections, but also discussions within NATO on how to make NATO resistant to Trump in a way that wouldn't totally endanger the whole concept of the alliance. So therefore, the second question is whether under that scenario, Europe can deliver, because all this discussion about strategic autonomy, that's nice, but that's still in the political realm. European countries have not really upscaled their defense structures. The allocation of budget for defense is only now starting to grow. Certainly, we've seen some effort in that respect. The fact that Sweden and Finland have joined NATO is certainly remarkable, and is a consequence of this more securitized European geography after the war in Ukraine. But a lot more is needed, and it's not clear whether Europe can actually deliver on that lot more bit. So that's the second component. The whole European security architecture question becomes much more difficult to address. And then the third part is, how do we combine Ukraine in this, and possibly, other regions, where the question being whether Europe can be a security provider for its, near neighborhood, including in the MENA region, and possibly, including also, the Northern Africa geography. There, of course, there are, a number of different ideas about how to make sure that in a settlement phase, the security of Ukraine is addressed in a way that prevents further conflicts in and around Ukraine. Because even if there is to be a political settlement, we've seen in other geographies, in Nagorno-Karabakh being one example, when a frozen conflict, if it remains, it can remain frozen for a while, but it's not really a solution that deters that frozen conflict from being transformed into an active war at some point in time when, the politics point in that direction. So the challenge for many policymakers will be to make sure that, in a settlement scenario, the solution to be provided to Ukraine in terms of security guarantees will be permanent and will be of a nature to avert conflict from emerging there in the years to come. Now, there we probably will be talking about a number of different bilateral security guarantees that possibly would need to have a nuclear dimension, because with US, UK, France, but also Turkey, which is not a nuclear power, might be involved. So that is going to be now part of the security architecture of Europe in a way that has not been in the past. Because in the past it was mostly about NATO Article 5, but now in the case of Ukraine we're looking at a different map, and that map is a bit like the map in Southeast Asia, where you have the US providing security guarantees on the basis of bilateral security commitments. In the case of Ukraine, that bilateral bit will be plurilateral, but it may or may not be NATO. If it is NATO, then we're back in the realm of something that we know, with Article 5 deterrence and so on. But if it's not NATO, namely if the path of Ukraine to NATO is stalled, or if it's a very long-term vision, then it will need to be more like a Southeast Asia type security guarantees, where you have bilateral deals between Ukraine, US, Ukraine, UK, Ukraine, Turkey, and so on. And that sort of network of bilateral security guarantees must be placed in the context of a political post-war settlement. And this is really something new for Europe, to tell you the truth. We don't really have an example of this in recent memory, because again, it was mostly the business of NATO to provide that sort of, security. Now, finally, what does that mean for, our near neighborhood beyond Ukraine, whether it is, Middle East or Northern Africa? Well, it essentially means that there is, after the war in Ukraine, there is almost a rude awakening within the European political establishment, that those nice, Fukuyama words of, history having ended, and that, democratic progress will be on a linear path, well, they were fallacies. And therefore, there is a return to hard politics, to hard power, to hard security, which means that over time, even if Trump is not elected, even if we have another Biden administration, it's really difficult to refute the hypothesis that something fundamental has changed within the US political context. And the Trumpism, whatever, you know, wherever you define it, will be a strong force to contend with in the United States. And therefore, the Europe, and here I mean Europe, not just the EU, we need to contend with that. And therefore, this, you know, path, this revitalization of the security debate, which again should not be limited to the EU, and this is where we need, you know, more progress, both, you know, intellectually but institutionally, that Europe's security cannot just be an EU affair. There needs to be a more inclusive approach to this. And if we start to walk, you know, down that path, that will also mean how Europe, again, not just the EU, but how Europe, with its set of security, you know, linkages, can actually project security in its near neighborhood. Because today, when we look even at the crisis between, you know, Israel and Gaza, Israel and Iran, mostly it's been an American affair. You know, European intervention has been much less visible. So Europe as a whole doesn't today have the, you know, the capacity to project that sort of, you know, security across its borders. So that's going to be part of the roadmap. I think it's inevitable, and but that discussion needs to be more inclusive and possibly more ambitious in the years to come.
Thank you, Sinan. Thank you. Just to keep up the tradition of summing up the points I noted, and I found that, which I find very interesting, is also thank you very much what you started. You mentioned Southeast Asia and Indonesia explicitly 2 times. That would be a very good way to pass the word over to Radityo from Ireland University in Surabaya, Indonesia. But before that, I also like that you stressed the risks that are upcoming, especially the US elections. You mentioned Trump a couple of times. And also, it's very good that you brought about the context of European security. And I quote, Europe's security cannot just be an American affair any longer, and what the European subcontinent need to do with that. I also like your comparison of the situation with the American bilateral security commitments in Southeast Asia and what is going to happen in Ukraine after the war. And I hope as a Ukrainian, after our victory of this war, it's very good that you raised this question, what the settlement would be so as to avert further conflicts from emerging in the future, especially having Russia as the neighbor, which is inevitable for Ukraine. Unfortunately, that I also should say as a Ukrainian, we have no geographical choice otherwise. It's interesting that you also mentioned the risk of Russia's of the room that Russia is given to put the test the credibility Article 5 of NATO, especially you also mentioned both Baltic states in that context. And of course, what is going to happen when if Trump is elected, and also that Europe, and you also explicitly stress not only the European Union, but the Europe as it is, as a continent, needs to tackle the issue of Trumpism in the United States, which is interesting and also very important in that respect. And also the position of Trump that you brought about, we in Ukraine do understand it very well, because this is one of his main messages, that Ukraine is your European problem, not our American problem, message. And so how to tackle all these complicated issues. But so not to steal again more of that time, thank you, Sinan. And I would like now to give floor to Radityo Dharmaputra from Indonesia. Thank you, Radityo, for joining. The floor is yours now.
So thank you, Maksym. I hope you can hear me. Okay, great. Once again, thank you for the invitation to attend and to participate in this very interesting discussion. And I'll be speaking more from the Indonesian perspective, but maybe also touching on Southeast Asian perspective in general. But you know, to just group Southeast Asian together, that would also be a problem, because then we have different interests, different views. But I think one of the main concerns for Indonesia, at least, there are several concerns, but one of the most important is the decline of multilateralism. So the idea that the United Nations Security Council or even the UN cannot solve any of this problem. So starting from in 2022 with Russian invasion of Ukraine and then the ongoing war. And then, as Rusbe mentioned, of particular note is the current situation in Gaza and Palestine. So those two things, from an Indonesian perspective, it already generates a lot of discussion among elites and scholars about the need to reform the system, about the need to talk about the UN, but not only about the UN. This idea that great powers can do what they want without any kind of balance or trying a counterbalance from other, let's say, international organization and so on, and that even small, maybe not great powers, smaller countries like Israel can do without, without the support of the UN Security Council, for example. That's already one of the biggest concerns in Indonesian policy circles. And then you bring the notion about the idea of sovereign of the norm, the international norm, international law, as the previous speakers mentioned, the idea that sovereign, the territorial sovereignty can be taken by other countries. It happened in Ukraine in 2014 and 2022, and then maybe other countries also. So this is two main concerns. One is the kind of multilateralism, the idea that international institution and organization cannot be trusted to solve the problem. And at the same time, the issue of sovereignty. And this brings or connect to what has been discussed before in Southeast Asia with the rise of China, with the emergence of this unilateral organization, AUKUS one and the Quad, and all these discussions. The US made its own unilateral, China might offer its own without trying to consolidate or trying to invite all countries in Southeast Asia. This has always been Indonesia's position, and I think also many Southeast Asian countries want ASEAN to be the basis for any kind of discussion and dialogue. But with the rise of unilateral organization, unilateral cooperation in Southeast Asia and Indo-Pacific, that's already created another concern. So can you imagine all those three coming together? The idea that international organization cannot solve the problems, the idea that great powers can do what they want, invading other countries, violating normal sovereignty. And at the same time, these great powers can then create this idea, unilateral organizations competing with each other. That brings me to the next point, that what concerns most in Southeast Asia, and at least in Indonesia, is that it seems to be, it's no longer a multipolar world. It's returning to this idea that there are two different sides. So the US with its European allies, and then Russia and China on the other hand. So there are just several discussions in the media here in Indonesia that puts together this, the start of the Third World War with two big countries, a big coalition, NATO on the one hand, NATO, the US, and for the so-called West on the one hand, and the other one, Russia, China on the other. So that creates a lot of problems for Indonesia, because also for many Southeast Asian countries, we have to balance or to try to balance the US and China for so long. That's one of the nature of Southeast Asia, trying to be maybe not in the middle, also not neutral, but trying to survive in this kind of security environment where the US, as one of the biggest, the major country in the region, supporting, as Sinan mentioned, supporting many countries bilaterally, having military cooperation with some countries in Southeast Asia. On the other hand, you have also China, with its economic power, also now military power in South China Sea and in Indo-Pacific, trying to compete with one another. And Southeast Asian countries try to be pragmatic, trying to survive by by collaborating with China on one hand, on the other hand, trying to invite the US. Indonesia is a good example. I mentioned to Maksym during his visit to Indonesia, the Indonesian army and military powers, the forces in Indonesian military, they balance each other. Indonesian army very close to China, Indonesian Navy, due to the nature of Chinese threat in the region, very close to the US, even inside Indonesia, this force is trying to balance one another. But that reached a certain point when the competition, competition getting more tense with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with the Americans and then Europeans trying to push all these countries into one position, which is very, again, most countries will take criticize Russia very strongly, without mentioning Russia. Again, very interesting way of balancing or trying to find a way in between, in the middle, being very pragmatic. Focusing on the norm of sovereignty, saying that Russian invasion or the invasion of Ukraine, without mentioning Russia, the invasion of Ukraine violates the norm of sovereignty, but they cannot move more than that. Russia is still a very big country with the presence of China as well there, and the understanding, maybe false, we can discuss about it, that Russia and China are now in one side. So taking position against Russia would mean maybe offending China, maybe have some problems with China in the future. So that they don't want to take. In the case of Indonesia, Indonesia will never or will not take position against great powers. And since Russia, China, the US is still considered as great powers, they're trying to be in the middle, trying to appease all powers. Again, you can see how Indonesia still invites Russia to the G20 meetings, even though at that time the US and many European countries trying to push Indonesia's government. So that idea of the current security architecture concerns from Indonesia and many Southeast Asian countries, focusing on, again, just to sum up the decline of multilateralism, the violation against the norm of sovereignty, the idea that great powers can do what they want, the rising unilateral cooperation in the region, and also this competition between great powers. I think that's the main concern regarding the security architecture. I'm not sure I answered the other two, but maybe Maksym will then have some more questions. I'll give the floor back to Maksym.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's true that I met with Aditya in person 2 times in Kyiv, had a pleasure, and a couple of weeks I returned from Indonesia, and we had this discussion. Interesting that you also brought about this topic, because my main question in Indonesia was how come such a big and very influential country still sees itself either as a middle power, not wanting to fall apart with great powers. It was a very interesting discussion. It's also the role of ASEAN is also very important that. But just again, to give a couple of points, it's great that you also brought into our discussion the United Nations as an organization. And from Ukraine perspective, we see the differences between the resolutions of the United Nations General Assembly. The majority of countries, also, of course, condemn the Russian invasion, the violation of human rights, and all things like that. But then there is a Security Council, which is based on the post-World War II architecture, in which the votings, because of the countries that have veto right, is completely different when compared to the United Nations General Assembly. So it's very interesting as that you also brought about this international player, and you also mentioned that from perspective of many countries, international institutions can no longer be trusted in solving the problems that arise around the globe, which is very interesting. And this attempt of many ASEAN countries to balance between US and China, it's a very, I do remember well when I went to Surabaya, this example of that the Indonesian army is more like China leaning, so to say, but Navy is an American leaning, is a good example inside of Indonesia, how this balance between great powers can look like in the region. which is also interesting. So how to structure the cooperation then, and unwillingness of the majority of countries, which can also be easily understood, to position itself against the great powers. It's also clear because it poses so many risks. Okay, so again, not to steal more of that time, I would like to go back to the question that you received from me then, now specifically moving specifically to the Russian war against Ukraine and how it affected the security landscape, not going globally, but in the Middle East, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Southeast Asia. So maybe a couple of your takes and views on how this particular war, Russia against Ukraine, affected the security landscape. Maybe you would like to elaborate more on that in details. And of course, if you have something to react when answering to what you heard from other participants, you're also warmly welcome. Okay, so we go around as we started. I would now pass the word to Timmy. Timmy, please.
Thank you very much. In terms of the impact, I think broadly speaking, I'll start by saying that from the African perspective, it has pushed quite two important things that was not really a big deal before the war, or let me say before COVID-19. And first is the fact that right now there's now an increased emphasis on boosting or enhancing the voice of the African agency, which is particularly the African Union. And the second thing, which I think it brings up is the reconsideration or a review. Let me put it that way: a review, looking inwards. A review is the preferable word. A review of the AU, the African Union's approach to global politics and internal security issues and how they are linked. Ukraine and I mean Eastern Europe generally provide African countries with a lot of food. This includes wheat, maize, sorghum, and millet, I think, and so on. So when the war hit, one of the first major impact was food shortage, which deals directly with the issue of food security, which would broadly fall under human security issues. And as a result of that, there were the internal pressures or the internal issues with respect to the developmental gaps within some of the African states were amplified. And in the African context, from my studies so far on the Africa peace and security architecture, I found that when conflict risks are high, it becomes a bit more, permit me to use the word, scary when it involves the grassroots not having access to basic needs, especially food. So when food gets more expensive, access to food becomes problematic, the tension tends to increase. And an example you will see happened in the Nigerian case because of the ongoing conflict in the northern part of, not conflict per se, but crisis that currently affects food production. And as a result of inflation, due to the strength of the currency, you could check the news, you see different instances of protests happening in quick succession within a short couple of weeks. And if this was not properly managed, for example, that could have escalated into something bigger. So that's just to highlight the importance of food security on the continent. And in the eastern side of Africa, where I reside, there are issues around drought. Climate change is seriously affecting food production, for example. So now imagine climate change challenges are there. There is drought. Some places are experiencing flooding. There are issues in some places between the farmers and the herders, and then there is shortage of grains, for example, that comes into the country, that provides a significant amount of the food supply that goes into all these regions. So one of the first major hits really was food security, was developmental part, because it then amplified the fact that we actually do not have food. So would I say perhaps an epiphany that then drove certain actors to say, perhaps we should reconsider Africa's dependence or over-dependence on food that comes from external actors, for example. So in a sense, you could say it is negative because of the short, immediate impact. But on the positive side, actually, broadly speaking, it has provoked a kind of process and of internal conversations on how to improve Africa's food security position in terms of production, distribution, and storage. And also because of the war, because of the issues, the impact, the political issues around it, there was also trade disruption for some African countries in terms of fuel price hike also happened. So this brought certain micro and macro economic, would I say, crisis for some African countries, which some are actually still dealing with and trying to seek sustainable alternatives. So broadly speaking, I would say the developmental dimension and the socioeconomic dimensions were the first hit. Second, which I consider to be more positive, is an increased intentionality by the Africa Peace and Security Architecture institutions, the APSA institutions, to be more deliberate about where Africa stands when it comes to global issues. And this was provoked by the debates at the level of the UN or the UN and the UN Security Council, which I would reference to. I'll make reference to what Percy said earlier about what goes on across the globe when seeking support, the hypocrisy, the dimensions of the hypocrisy. So there is now a more deliberate, enlightened approach by APSA institutions, led by the AU, pardon me, to be more intentional about, okay, where really does Africa stand? When Africa says, this is what we want, can we defend it? Do we have the political and the diplomatic capital to stand our ground? Do we have the same to protect our member states, AU member states, in the occasion that there's some kind of leverage from an external actor to force them to hold a position? Because for Africa, it's not necessarily about supporting Russia or supporting the US or supporting Europe, as Percy mentioned earlier. It's more about where is the African identity in the global debate? Where is the African voice in the global debate? So as negative as the Russian war has been, both to the globe and to various African contexts, one of the major positive sides that I would emphasize would be the realization for the need to strengthen the African voice at the global stage. And lastly, I would say that one of the other issues that also contributed to that line of thought is that many peace and security projects on the continent actually depend on funds that come from the EU and European countries. As a result of the war, there were budget cuts that affected some of the projects, some of the programs, and so on and so forth. As a result of that, you then if you check the timeline of where there has now been emphasis on being deliberate about the Africa Peace Fund, for example, or being deliberate about AU member states' investments in peace and security, in conflict prevention, it was more amplified. So I would I say categorize my response to that question in two forms. The first side of the impact is indeed the socioeconomic and developmental impact that actually provoked amplified certain conflict risks that wasn't pleasant, because it did encourage certain tensions that could have been avoided. But on the positive side is the realization for the need to strengthen the African agency, to strengthen that intentionality when it comes to investment in conflict prevention, investment in food security, and investment in pushing that African agenda at the global stage to say this is what Africa stands for. We want to be able to deal on our own terms, not just on the terms of others to our own detriment. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Timmy. I would like to mention that before going to Indonesia a couple of weeks ago, I spent 1 week in South Africa. And I do understand, as Raditya mentioned, that Southeast Asia is also a diverse collection of different countries. I do understand the African continent is very diverse. But one of the issues that you also mentioned, you started with this position, is the voice of African agency on international arena. And one of the topics that I discussed with my colleagues who are working together on a joint paper was, for example, the issue of nuclear security. And the African continent is a good example of Pelindaba Treaty. Now the Russian occupation of the largest in Europe nuclear power plant, and also the plans of several African countries to develop more the nuclear power plants and energy on these things, like to build more of them, now having only one, is also interesting how the African voice with African experience of treaties in that regard can be internationalized. So thank you very much for bringing this topic. Also the topic of food security. As a Ukrainian, I have to admit that majority of Ukrainians, I mean common citizens, were not aware how important we as country, as agriculture producers, are important in the world supply of food, and also to Africa, for example. We were just not aware. I mean, the majority people were not aware how important, we knew that we are an important agriculture country, but we didn't know how important, how globally important we are. And thank you for mentioning that. And also the issues when you rightfully said that when the grassroots, when they don't have access to the basics like food, it also can lead to unrest and instability in the region. And this is how things in the world are interlinked. And also, again, we also summed up like in a circle, bringing about where the African voice in the is in the global debates. And I think it also relates to what Raditya said about the United Nations. And I would develop it further as the need for reform of the United Nations Security Council, because by statistics, the majority, over 50% of the issues discussed in the United Nations Security Council are related to the African continent, but not a single African country is a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. This is also an issue about bringing more voices to the Security Council, in need for reform of the United Nations and this institution and its architecture. So thank you very much, Timmy. Not stealing more time, I would then move on with discussing. Now give floor to Ruspe, please. The floor is yours. Either the question of how the Russian war against Ukraine impacted the situation, or maybe your comments to what you heard from the previous speakers. Thank you.
Well, I think I would thank you. I would agree with a lot of the things that Timmy said. I think the same applies to the Middle East. As an historian, perhaps I would then rather like to take a step back and say that first of all, multipolarity, which as far as I can see is one of the reasons, one of the better prisms to try and interpret the present world, precedes Ukraine. But Ukraine, like many other events, if you want to call it that, tends to accelerate some of those trends. So the fact that, for instance, states in the Middle East were trying to hedge, as in trying to become more autonomous in their relationships with the world beyond their immediate security providers, which was the United States, was something that preceded the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but it was accelerated because it showed them how potentially vulnerable they would be, irrespective of all the different ways they try to kind of create insurance for themselves, whether it was internal elite, political elite insurance, or the external territorial insurance. So in that sense, I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine accelerated that bit. But we should also be fair, if you will, in one sense. Trump accelerated the other dimension of this autonomy, which is that the United States for some time has been weaponizing the financial instruments which underpin the liberal order which it guarantees. And this in turn, of course, has incentivized other countries to complement again, to make sure that there are other ways of trading with those the US would not want them to trade with. And this was this was a trend that's been going on for some time. And if you want, you can say that President Obama was much more subtle, discreet in the way he used this weapon. But then came Trump and did it very much in your face, which of course incentivizes a lot of countries to kind of accelerate their own ability to trade beyond the United States. So these are, I think, trends that now are almost enmeshed, and it is easy afterwards to kind of think of them as the same. They're not, but they're both ways in which this long-term trend, at least as far as I can see, have been accelerated. Food security is absolutely crucial. And as you mentioned yourself, Maksym, I think, let's be fair, a lot of people in the world did not think about how the food came to their table. And I think this is an aspect, if you will, of the modern way of understanding, or rather not understanding, globalization, which the Russian invasion kind of highlighted, is the vulnerability of logistical supply chains for anything, from your iPhone to the grain that becomes a cereal on your table. Now, of course, in some countries, this is much more clear because they live on that brink. If you take Egypt with 100 million people, totally dependent on import of wheat and other things, that is, and basically the whole, if you want to make it very simplistically, you can say the whole stability of political elite is based on people at least being able to eat bread. Now, what happens when Ukraine is cut off from being able to supply the world market is two things. First of all, you cannot find the grain. Or secondly, it costs more than you can pay. So we also see the uneven effect depending on how poor or rich a country is. So Saudi Arabia can easily buffer itself and import where it can find it, and it can still find it because it can pay for it. Egypt or Lebanon, not so much. So it affects immediately not only the stability of the country, but also the stability of the political rulers in being able to at least provide this, if not much else, unfortunately, because of mismanagement. And I think this, and if you want, there is a parallel, in my opinion, also to the materiality of war. I think the war in Ukraine has also shown us that when you are fighting a modern war between countries that are in some respects on equal terms, military technology-wise, logistics is what wins or loses a war. If you look at all the other modern world wars that Western powers have been fighting, it's been done from a technological superiority. They have not needed as much bombs to get the job done, and the supply chains have held. But now what you see is when it's on more equal terms, it becomes a war of attrition. And then it becomes the calculation of what the factory can produce, how far away it is from the front, and how quickly you can get it there. So I think it's, in a sense, a kind of parallel to the idea that it's not just about that someone produces food, you actually have to get it to the person who needs it. And this showed how much more complicated this is. So what we're seeing now as well, of course, is what in modern buzzword parlor is called friendshoring. So now everyone is, in a sense, trying to retract a bit and make sure that the supply chain is primarily, if not exclusively, within the territorial sovereignty of allies, or at least friendly states. And this, of course, again, goes back to the whole notion of complementarity. No one's going to be able to do that. You can't simply just return all production of everything to your own country, or even countries that you like. You would have to basically upend modern capitalism, which might be a welcome proposition, but it's not going to happen anytime soon, just because of these supply chain problems. So there is also the element of what exactly it's going to be friendshored, and is it going to be enough with making sure it's in one friend's shore? That is, you need to make sure that you have redundancy in this system. And I doubt that you're going to be able to create a redundant system where the fail-safe is only with countries you like, or countries that one of your allies like. And therefore, by definition, you need to keep a lot of more doors open than what the global power that you are primarily allied with would prefer. Thank you.
Thank you, Osypchuk. Thank you very much. Just again to reiterate, I like that you started with this issue of US weaponizing the financial means. And I cannot, especially when discussing food and food supply, I cannot make these jokes because we all experienced long before we got to know the American strategy, we all experienced it from Russian sides, and there are many jokes and memes of Russians declaring Polish apples to be dangerous because falling out politically, and then declaring Moldovan wines to be poisonous. And then later came the Ukrainian dairy products, that the Ukrainian milk and sour cream was declared poisonous and dangerous for Russian consumers. So in Ukraine, we all know this. And also Georgian wines, they have this issue. Once the country decides to move closer to the Western world as such, its food is declared dangerous and poisonous by Russians. So we know how Russia weaponizes different means also in terms of food supplies. It's good that you brought about this topic. I quote, a lot of people in the world were not aware how food came to their tables. It's very important. This is a good feeling that we now see how globalized the world is. And I also would like to quote you that the whole stability is about people able to eat bread. And there are two factors which impact that, is either the availability of grain. And also you mentioned the very important topic of food supply. It's great that we have Sinan with us, because for Ukraine, the Turkish involvement in providing this corridor for Ukrainian export of grain was very important. I think this is one of the important things at the onset of war that we managed to do that. And of course, the second issue is the issue of prices, because when something is too expensive, that certain countries, unlike Saudi Arabia, are not, so they don't have means actually to buy the very expensive food. It also impacts everything. You also brought about the very important issue of global logistics, because the logistics is what loses or wins the war. And it's great that you mentioned that. And of course, you said, interesting, I would like to quote you that you cannot be sure that you can only have logistic chains within your countries that you're friends with or your allies are friends with, which brings about also a very important topic in that respect of how we organize the world trade and what principles it is based on and how security is guaranteed for that. Okay. So again, not stealing much of your time. Thank you for your contribution and reaction. I would now give the floor, as we follow the order, to Sinan, please. Microphone, please.
Yeah. I think in the first round, I've already talked about the security implications. So maybe I'll follow what Ruzbe has, I think, very eloquently already discussed, which is more the political implications for Europe in terms of its relations with its neighborhood, and particularly here, Africa and the global South. Because one thing that we have noticed is that after the start of the war, Americans and Europeans were essentially shocked in terms of how little moral support they received to their political line of seeing Russia as the aggressor party in defense of Ukraine. In the countries of the global South, and there you can, of course, also include many of the African nations. So this was the start of a acknowledgement of in Europe that their own relationship, even on an area that, from the standpoint of international law, seemed very black and white, right? Sitting in Europe, Russia is the aggressor. It is the country that has violated the UN Charter, and therefore there needs to be, wholehearted support to Ukraine, not only because it is Ukraine, but also in order to protect the rules-based order. But what in this neighborhood we see as a very clear black and white case did not appear so in the rest of the world, and therefore there was I think a much belated but I think welcome focus on why that is so. Why is it that even such a clear act is not seen under the same light as some of the European nations see it? Why is it that there has not been more support to this political line in Africa, in countries that have an influence as well on global public opinion, ranging from Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, you name it. And therefore, the issue, in addition to what Ruzbe has alluded to, which is more about how you align your own interest and your quest for autonomy in order to ensure the sustainability of not only your food supplies but generally of supply chain. There's also a political dimension to that. And this was really a surprise, I think, when you look back at the discussions in Europe, at this awakening of, why is it that this line of thought has not received more support globally after what Russia has done. And so this is where, things, especially from the standpoint of Europe-Africa relations, and even more particularly between individual member states, be it France, UK, Germany, or others, have become to weigh on the topic, because a lot of what we heard when we asked this question to our counterparts in the African nations was essentially criticism of the European double standards. So this long legacy of European double standards with regard to Africa has come to play a very visible role when Europe wants something out of those countries in terms of their political support, even to what I believe to be a very clear-cut case like the war in Ukraine. So to me, one of the consequences of this war more broadly really was this acknowledgement that there is a need now to have a more robust, clear-minded dialogue with our own neighbors about international norms, not only just in the field of security, but generally about how to protect this rules-based order. And there is really a need for some of these European nations to look back at their own attitude over the years and acknowledge this criticism of double standards, because without which it will be difficult to move on this discussion. You see some of the backlash in Africa lately, in some of the countries like Chad, Mali, where they have, totally overhauled and reviewed their policy on the relations with, the major European and American powers. But this is, I think, one of the consequential strategic outcomes for Europe, this acknowledgement, because this need for having a healthy dialogue, and here I think it's really about dialogue, to have an eye-to-eye dialogue with, I think for lack of a better term, I would say the constructive part of the Global South, is what has been rekindled or kindled by, by the war in Ukraine. And now we're only at the beginning of hopefully, a more constructive path towards this dialogue, because this would, in any case, there was a need to restart this with this type of acknowledgement. And I think that the war in Ukraine and its consequences have made that clear. So hopefully there will be progress on this. To have, a very, fair, constructive eye-to-eye dialogue on the shape of the multilateral system, multilateral norms, and how these can be advanced in the future in a more collective and inclusive manner, without which this division is only likely to deepen, and and to the detriment of what we see to be, the more democratic part of the world, as opposed to the influence of the less democratic part of the world, which is probably an outcome that we want to avoid.
Thank you very much, Sinan. And I'm glad that you also brought this topic. You started with the moral support and seeing the picture from the European and North American perspective, black and white. There's clearly an aggressor, and there's also our Ukrainian position. There is an aggressor in the country that has been invaded by a neighbor. But then you brought about a very important topic of how to have this open and healthy dialogue, I quote you, to discuss international law and how to protect the rule-based order, not in a hypothetical way, but all around the globe. The approach would be the same to similar conflicts. And it's interesting that you brought about the example of Kenya. I think in Ukraine, the speech on the eve of an invasion of Martin Kimani, Kenya's representative to the United Nations, was very well received, about his reaction to Russia's position on redrawing the borders and historical injustices and things like that. Thank you for bringing about that. And I think I cannot say even add more that I also support the idea that this dialogue was, as you said, the constructive part of the global South, and discussions on how to go on with protecting the rule-based order and how to develop that, not only as an idea, but the practicalities of how to implement that is very important. Thank you, Sinan. And I would like now to give the floor to Radityo for his comments and remarks. Radityo, please.
Thank you, Maksym. Yes, again, being the last speaker in this order, make it very easy because I can just continue what the other already mentioned. I agree that food security came, especially in the beginning. Indonesia also, especially Indonesia, also suffer from rising food prices. But the problem with food security is that in the beginning, we didn't even know. Indonesians also didn't know that we were dependent on Ukraine. That's also, I think, both sides. Even the Ukrainian doesn't know that Indonesia buys a lot of grain from Ukraine. So that's, I think, one way to put it. So food security, but also I think the realization that this Russian invasion, again, it can trigger other great powers especially in Southeast Asia. China is the closest great power and already have problems with in terms of border, problems with Vietnam, with Philippines, with Malaysia, with Indonesia. So the realization that if Russia can invade other countries, can invade Ukraine without any proper response, that China can do the same in Southeast Asia. Having said that, I think it's also important to notice that the reaction from the US, from European countries to the Russian invasion, and again, just to refer back to the first topic we discussed, hypocrisy, the long, the history of hypocrisy, especially from the West in Southeast Asia, maybe also in Africa, in other parts of the world. It makes these countries that, by principle, they should support Ukraine. They are worried that this could happen also in Southeast Asia. But at the same time, they are very, they realize that it is very delicate. Instead of confronting China, I think most countries in Southeast Asia trying to be more moderate, trying to have good relations with China, even more so at the moment. But I think one of the lessons from the Russian invasion is that again, as I think Roosevelt also mentioned before, you cannot depend on one, your allies. Even if China is the largest investor in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia still thinks that having a good relations with the US is important to balance China. So I think that now becomes more relevant. Before, the Indonesian government really focused on bring China into Indonesia, trying to focus more on the economic side of its relations. But the Russian invasion, again, make it so that the Indonesian government rethinks their approach, that we need to also beef up our military capabilities, trying to increase our military capabilities. And the one way to do that, usually it's with the Russian, buying military, from the Russian, but now it's from having a good cooperation with the Americans, with the US. The current Minister of Defense, or probably the future president, now the president-elect Prabowo Subianto, already have a very good relations with the US, notwithstanding his background and his history in the 90s and in the 80s and 90s. But at the same time, his first, let's say, unofficial visit after he was elected was to China. So again, he's trying to bring balance to this now. I think that's one of the most important lessons or most important impacts. So maybe not talking about Ukraine per se, because Ukraine is too far from the region, and even European and Russian is too far from Southeast Asia. To bring the Southeast Asian perspective, meaning to bring US and China into the picture here, and the idea of great power competing in your neighboring areas is very similar. Maybe in Ukraine side is the EU or US, NATO, and Russia. In the Indonesian case, maybe Southeast Asian case, it's China and the US. So it is very similar to China. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Raditya. Thank you, and I hope nobody is like offended by the sequence of speakers, because it's just how we compose the program. So it was like, oh, you're very important. Sorry for that, because this was like a technicality. So you still need somehow to order the speakers, but it was not. I mean, it was not meant to offend somebody in any way. And I would to stress, because we just have like 4 minutes left, and just a brief summary from my side, and then we might be 1 minute for each of you to like sum up, or maybe to bring your like ideas, so that, or maybe your takeaways from this discussion. But thank you for bringing about again this idea of not only great powers competing and how to balance between them in different regions, which is very important, but also this very important thing. I will call it just a thing, because if one country, a great superpower, can invade another country, like a great power superpower can invade and then go unpunished for that, would that trigger another great powers or big powers to do something in their region to their neighbors? This is a very important issue that you mentioned at the beginning. But dear friends and colleagues, maybe because we now have like 3 minutes left of our discussion, I don't want to keep you longer. Maybe in the order that we had, you would like to maybe just one sentence, less than a minute, sum up or to take away from this discussion. Please, Timmy, I would like to start with you then.
Thank you very much. So just a minute. The point I would like to highlight is that Africa's international relations is going under serious reconsideration by the AU, by AU member states, and now increasingly even Africans themselves. There has been more interest, and the world needs to recognize that. And as a result of that, if we are to focus on practical steps to understand Africa better, I would suggest that we all look into the AU's Agenda 2063, the points, the goals that it has set. I would suggest that we go through also the African position on the new agenda for peace, which was published by the UN. I would also like to highlight questions around the historical behaviors of international financial institutions, which was mentioned earlier, and how Africa now interprets it, not just African institutions, but the African peoples themselves in relation to the internal political and economic concerns, and also the UN Security Council, as well as historical injustices that the African citizens and the AU are beginning to pay more attention to. So if it's not exhaustive, but if we're able to put that together, then we'll probably have a better understanding that could help But as far as being affirmative is, I don't think we're at the point where we can be affirmative of the African position or perspective, because as I said, it is going through a process of reconsideration and review. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Osypchuk, please.
Yes, I'll be brief because I also have to run to another thing. I think the important thing here is that the Europeans and the Americans don't consider all of this a matter of threat. I think if one simply sees these transformations as threatening, one won't be able to develop any kind of actual policy that can neither be proactive or constructive. So burying your head in the sand, as it were, and claiming that what was has to be kept at all costs without any consideration for that the world has changed, whether you like it or not, is not particularly constructive. And of course, as I said, that was the first thing I said in my first intervention, hypocrisy abounds, but that doesn't mean that one should not try and lessen it and reduce it. And I think as far as my region is concerned, the European and American way of managing Gaza is the foremost obstacle for anyone taking them seriously when they want to talk about Ukraine, which they should, but to help your own case, as it were. And this, of course, reflects not on Ukraine. This is not Ukraine's responsibility. This is the European and American responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Osypchuk. Sinan, are you with us? Please, yeah. Your minute, so to say, please.
Yes, Maksym, I'll just use 10 seconds in order to excuse myself because I have another session that started 1 minute ago at 2. So I just want to thank you for the organization and please accept my apologies for leaving.
No, thank you. Teşekkür ederim again. Thank you for being with us and have a nice session then. Now, Editio, the word, sorry, goes to you now, please.
Thank you, Maksym. I would just like to echo what Elizabeth mentioned. Again, for Indonesian, especially Indonesian, the European and the American position on Gaza are very important. And it is very difficult for anyone to talk about Ukraine. This issue about Gaza and Palestine is not yet, maybe not resolved, but trying to borrow Roosevelt words, trying to lessen the hypocrisy, trying to be more, trying to change a little bit in that sense, maybe trying to have discussion and dialogue. And the other thing, which would be my last thing, is trying to, again, all this, what we discuss is very important. It's not a threat to the West, not a threat to Europe. This is just what other regions feels and thinks. And I think it is very important for the European Union, for Europeans, for Europe, for the Americans as well, to try to understand. As for Ukrainians, I think there are a lot of similarities, similar position that many of these countries in Southeast Asia, and especially Indonesia, have with Ukraine. But the problem is that we don't talk to each other that much. So I think that's very important. Again, trying to have discussion, trying to understand one another, even though the position might differ a lot. But once you discuss it, apparently it's very similar, just a different calculation, different background, historical background. So, discussion, definitely. But for European and the Americans, definitely a change in approach to talk about it, especially to bring Ukraine without bringing Gaza. I think in the case of Indonesia, and of course, as Luzbek said, many countries in the Middle East will be very difficult at the moment. So that's the task for the European and Americans. Before bringing Ukraine, then you have to bring as well the situation in Gaza. That would be my take. Thank you much.
Oh, thank you, Timi, and thank you, Osypchuk, and Sinek was with us. I just hope that our voices will be heard, and I think we'll do the best maybe to summarize discussion, maybe publish something based on it. And thank you very much for finding time. And I finish with what Roditio said. I also support the idea to talk more to each other, to have more dialogue. So I would like us all to continue cooperation, maybe to see in person, maybe do some collaboration together to make our voices heard. So thank you very much, dear colleagues, and I wish you, everybody also who listened to us and watched our discussion, a very nice afternoon. Bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Maksym. Thank you all.